Hello, everybody, and welcome to One Question with Pastor Adam. And I am Adam, and I am pastor to believers and to doubters, to unfaithful Christians and faithful atheists. And Jesus was not afraid of questions, and neither are we here at One Question with Pastor Adam. And so we are here on Thursdays, every Thursdays, for at 11 o'clock Pacific. And we are here to talk about religion, spirituality, theology, whatever it is that we have questions about. And today I am so excited because we have a special guest today. A lot of people, kind of condemn social media, but social media can also be a wonderful place where people can get together and meet. And I am excited because our guest today is someone that I met on TikTok. Talk of all places. So this is awesome, a special treat. This is Dr. Mark Waters, a professor of religion and servant leadership in McMurry's Department of Religion and Philosophy. Dr. Waters is also the director of the Center for International Education at McMurry University. So I'm excited to have Dr. Waters on. Hey, Joshua, we are live. Yes, indeed, my friend. So today we're going to talk about something called religious pluralism and civic pluralism. And I'm excited for this because when I was in college, I read a lot of somebody named Houston Smith. And Houston Smith was like the textbook. He wrote the textbook on world religions for colleges during that time. And it was just a great way to explore all the different religions and the things they had in common and the things that were different from them. And it kind of got me interested in this idea of religious pluralism. And we're going to go to the basics here today. Dr. Waters teaches courses on this, and so it can get pretty complicated and in the weeds. And so we are going to just do kind of an introduction to religious pluralism today with all the different religions that we interact with now in this global world. It's crucially important to understand one another, and Dr. Waters is doing a great job with that. So I am going to bring in Dr. Mark Waters in now, and let's welcome Mark to the show. Hi, Mark.
Hello. Good
Welcome.
to be here.
It's good to have you here. Good to have you here. And I don't say this very often, but thank God for TikTok.
That's right. Yeah. It's good to meet you.
It's good to meet you too. How long have you been on TikTok, and why did you decide to get onto TikTok?
I haven't been on very long. I never thought I would want to be on it.
Uh-huh.
I didn't know what was there. And my daughter showed me some TikTok videos. She's of a generation that does do TikTok.
Yeah.
And I realized, hey, there's more here than meets the eye. And so I got to watch you and others. And there's a lot of good educational material on there.
It's great. Like you have to
Yeah.
pack everything into well, at first it was like a minute. Now they have up to
Mhm.
10 minutes and stuff, but it was very challenging to pack everything into one
Sure.
minute. So it's fun, but
Yeah.
there is so much great education out there on religion and anti-racist movements and
Mhm.
things like that, and LGBTQ issues too. It's just a wonderful
Right.
wealth of information. So hi, Joshua, Luke, and Dina. Sarah, hello to you. We're going to be talking about religion in general today, and talking with Mark about religion a little bit earlier. And this last week, as we were talking about what we wanted to talk about today, the word religion is problematic. Just to start with. And so I was wondering if we could start with what is this word religion, and how might we have a misconception of it today?
Okay, I think I'll start with etymology, the development of the word, but most scholars would criticize me for that
Okay.
because you can't go by the etymology of the word in terms of what it has developed into over time. You know, words have usage, not meaning, and the
Mm.
way we use words now may or may not depend on their etymology. But I think the etymology is interesting,
Yeah.
and I can make a point with that. So, and there are two words that were interpreted from Latin
Mm.
to mean religion or to express that word. First, from Cicero, relegere with an E, relegere, and it means to reread or to retrace. In other words, just
Mm,
being very precise about something. And so for Cicero and for the Romans, it didn't matter what you believed. Religion wasn't about a belief system. You just did your proper duty in the temple. And
mm,
so whatever God it was in the temple. And so to reread or retrace was just to be very specific, do your duty in the temple, and belief had nothing to do with it, really. I mean, I'm sure they had beliefs, but that's how Cicero interpreted it. And then much later on, there was a man named Lactantius who
mm,
was kind of the theological assistant to Constantine. You'll recall that Constantine in the year 312, 313 legalized Christianity in the Roman Empire. And Lactantius was his theological assistant, kind of
mm.
helping him out with theology. And Lactantius said that religion is from religare instead of relegere, religare with an I.
Okay.
And he said that the word means to rebind or to
Mm,
reconnect. And that, in terms of etymology, that's what most people think of today. And they think of just in terms of the bare bones to rebind or to reconnect with God or with each other. Uh, but then you want to go into the problematic part?
yes.
Word?
Well,
Okay.
it's interesting because I had always heard that ligere meant like was like ligaments, and so
Right.
it was like trying to
That's right.
rebind ligaments together. And
Exactly.
is that right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what's problematic about this word?
Okay. What gets problematic is, well, first, like I said earlier, words have usage and not meaning,
Mhm,
or at least their meaning is based on their usage. And that comes from a philosopher named Wittgenstein
mm,
and then others. So part of the problem is just that words have usage and not meaning, and
mm,
different people use them in different ways. But the first problem I would identify is a lot of languages don't have a word that directly translate into English as religion.
ah,
Now they end up getting translators end up using the English word religion to translate sometimes. So, for example, in Greek, and I've had Greek, I'm not a Greek scholar. I got this information from the Greek scholar on our
uh-huh,
faculty. But in Greek, for example, um, there, there are words for praise and for worship and for devotion. And sometimes words like that in English Bibles will get translated
mm,
as religion. But that's not a direct translation from the Greek. So we're not to the big problems yet, but my next illustration will make it a little more problematic. And then we'll get into colonialism, which is even more problematic.
mm,
But
mhm,
but my next, I want to tell a story that illustrates this. I had uh, a few years ago. It's been a while. Our school would go to India for mission trips to work in a children's home in India. And we weren't proselytizing. We were just there to serve. And
mm,
it was a very diverse setting religiously with the children in the children's home. And so one year I had the opportunity to teach a religions of the world class there.
mm,
And we had some of our McMurray students in the class, and then some of the older students in an English school in India in the class. They were younger than college age, but they were some of the older students uh, in the that were in the English school. And a student asked me a question, and he said, "Sir," they always began their questions with "Sir," which was a little humbling, uh, but they always began their questions with "Sir." He said, "Sir, what is the difference between caste and religion?"
mm,
Now, the Hindi language and Sanskrit languages don't have a specific word for religion, but this young man knew English. So, what is the difference between caste
hmm,
and religion? And I don't remember how I answered him at that time. It probably wasn't a very helpful answer. But what I know now is the Sanskrit word that often gets translated into English as religion is the word dharma, Dharma. And so in Hinduism and Buddhism, you'll hear about dharma. And it basically means, or it can mean duty. So what this young man was equating that with, he was thinking of religion, dharma, as duty. And he was thinking of caste in his culture. And you define your duty in life by the caste that you're in. And so even that's not really about believing a certain set of doctrines. It's about what you're born into. And I think he was probably one of the lower castes. It's hard to know for sure, but I just thought that was extremely interesting to realize that and this wouldn't be everybody in India. Another thing I want to point out today is that, and I'll get back to the term religion, but all religions are internally diverse, but especially Hinduism. And, if I say one thing about a religion, there are going to be other people in that religion who have a different view. That's just part of it. But it just surprised me that there are a lot of people, probably in India, who would see religion just as the duty of their caste. So that interesting.
That's the way that my Muslim friends have often described Islam too. Much more as like we would have like for Christianity, it's much more like a belief system, right? For better or for worse. And many other religions are much more duty oriented.
Absolutely.
Does that rings true to you, that Christianity is a little different than a lot of religions in that sense?
We early in our history, we inherited Greek philosophy in the West. That didn't come through as much in the East, but we inherited Greek philosophy in the West. And then time went by, we got to the Enlightenment, and belief just became extremely important in Western Christianity. But like you mentioned in Islam and also in Judaism, it's your practice in life that's important, not specifically what you believe.
Yeah. Dina says, is this like sociology versus theology? What role does sociology play in?
Sociology is important. And in this case, I wouldn't say it's sociology versus theology. I've taught sociology of religion before, and I'm rusty on it. It's been a while since I've taught it. But I would say it's a mix. It's not one versus the other, but it's a mixture of the two. And part of the reason I would say that is that religion is something that's social. If you're going to talk about religion, you're talking about something that's social. And I would also say that religion is a form of culture. It's a cultural construct. And so it's almost impossible to talk about religion without some element of sociology coming into the picture. So that's a very good question and a good insight.
Yeah. It goes back to if we go back to the etymology of it, the rebinding, right? The sense in which religion, we typically think of rebinding us back to God or deities or something, but the sociological aspect of it is also rebinding us back to one another.
Absolutely.
Maybe. And this is the social element of it. Dina says, that makes sense. So good.
Emil Durkheim, who is kind of the father of sociology, said that religion is the glue that holds society together. And he didn't personally believe in God, but he still saw religion as that glue, that binding.
Yeah, that's good stuff. So how did you get interested in studying religion?
Okay, I grew up, and this is going to sound internally contradictory. I grew up in Lubbock, Texas. I'm now in Abilene, Texas, two of the most conservative cities in the nation. I grew up in Lubbock in a liberal church, and that liberal church happened to be Baptist, of all things. And we started ordaining women back in the 70s. And I was proud of them, and I'm Episcopalian now, but I was proud of my home church a few weeks ago. I read that they got kicked out of the Baptist General Convention of Texas because they accept LGBTQ folks. And so that's kind of the setting I grew up in as a Baptist. I really admired my home pastor growing up.
Mm.
He had a PhD, which isn't that frequent in Baptist life. If you know who Harry Emerson Fosdick was, who was at the big Riverside Church in New York, he wrote his dissertation on Fosdick. And so this was just a really bright guy. And it kind of, that's part of what made me interested in getting a PhD and going into the pastorate. And so I'm glad I have a PhD now because I want to teach and I can,
Mm.
but I never planned on teaching. I planned on being a pastor. And for 17 years, I was a Baptist pastor. And then later, for a number of reasons, uh, both theological and social, I became Episcopalian instead of Baptist. And there are still good people, of course, in the Baptist church. I'm not rejecting them.
Mm.
It's not like it's something I have to deconstruct in terms of how I live with it, but I feel more at home in the Episcopal church.
Mm.
And then what got me involved, a couple of things got me involved in interfaith. Uh, One thing is a very strong feeling that I've had since I was a young kid for social justice
Mm.
and equality for all people and treating all people fairly. And when I was a little kid, I loved watching cowboy and Indian
Mhm.
movies, as politically incorrect as
Yeah.
that is.
Yeah.
I loved watching those as a kid, but I was always for the Indians.
Oh,
And I would get upset and sometimes cry when the Cowboys won. And so
interesting.
that's just an illustration of me being for the marginalized
Mm.
early in my life, and that kept coming through. So that's one of the first things that got me interested in interfaith work. And then another thing, just thinking things through, I tend to live a lot in my head, and I started thinking about, and of course I believe in an old Earth and evolution. I'm not a young Earth guy. I believe that we've been around for a long time, and I started thinking, you know, how many people have existed through the history of the world?
Mm.
Uh, how many people existed before Christianity ever came about? And we've got what, almost 7 billion people in the world right now.
Mm.
Why would a God who is a God of the whole universe focus on the tiny little sliver of people that we
Yeah.
call Christianity?
Yep.
And I still identify as a Christian, but that got my mind expanding. And the way I think about it has developed over time. But my first thought was God is a lot bigger than the
Mm.
church, and God is a lot bigger than Christianity.
Amen. Preach it, brother. Let's go.
So that's how I got into interfaith work, teaching world religions. I was a pastor for a long time, and I was interested in world religions, but it wasn't until I got to McMurray University 16 years ago
Mm.
that I started teaching world religions. In graduate school, I had enough work in that to be qualified to teach it, but I've obviously learned a lot more since I've been teaching it. So that was another step in my interfaith journey. And then we have an interfaith council here in Abilene Interfaith Council,
Mm.
that works on interfaith diversity issues. And so all of those different things have fed in both to my interest in religion, my interest in religious diversity, and my interest in interfaith work.
Fascinating. So, Dina, I thought of you, Dina, when Mark said Lubbock, because Dina
Uh,
lives in Lubbock, and Dina says,
wow.
which church is it in Lubbock that you are talking about?"
It's Second Baptist Lubbock. Are you familiar with Second Baptist?
We'll see, Dina. Maybe Dina, Second Baptist Lubbock. Let us know if
It
you
was
are
on
familiar.
53rd and Elgin when I was growing up. It's out on
Ah,
82nd Street now.
Dina says yes, yes, I am familiar. So
Okay, cool.
so we'll see. There's hope in Lubbock, and
That's right.
as Luke says, we are all Lubbock in a spiritual sense. So
Right.
there's hope in Lubbock. There's hope for all of us there. So
Yes.
good stuff. So what is religious pluralism? You teach religious pluralism, and I know that we could talk for a semester or even longer about religious pluralism. But
Right.
how would you explain religious pluralism in a nutshell, if you will?
Okay. And some of this is coming from a a woman at Harvard, a professor at Harvard named Diana Eck, and some of it's coming from the head of Interfaith America called Eboo Patel. I'm a professor. I have to cite my
That's
sources.
good. That's
I
good.
feel guilty if I don't cite my sources.
Uh,
But anyway, I first pluralism is more than diversity. Diversity can be good or bad. Bad things can happen because of diversity, and good things can happen because of diversity. Pluralism, the way I'm talking about it, is engaging diversity in a way that makes it a good thing. And over the history of theologies, plural theologies of religion, looking at different religions, several words have come about, including the word pluralism. So I'm going to describe some of those words to get us up to pluralism and then make another distinction in what I mean. So Alan Race is a religious scholar, and he wrote a book about different ways that people in different religions relate to each other. And so he has three things. I have four now. His first description was exclusivism, which speaks for itself. Basically, exclusivism is you're excluded. My religion is right and your religion is wrong. And then there's inclusivism. Inclusivism basically says my religion is right, but it's possible for people in other religions to come into contact with truth. Just because you find truth in an unexpected place doesn't mean it's not true. And the Catholic Church at Vatican II really picked up on this. There was one scholar named Karl Rahner, who you're familiar with, who talked about the anonymous Christian, which on the one hand sounds kind of neat at first. My first reaction was like yours. Sounds kind of neat. We're including other people, even though they're not Christian, they're included in salvation. And on the one hand, that's a positive statement. On the other hand, it's kind of paternalizing and disrespectful to say, oh, you're an anonymous Christian.
Right.
If you're Christian, those of us who are Christian, how would we like for someone to come up to us and say, oh, you're really an anonymous Hindu?
Right. Yes.
So that's right. But then there's also a document, and you can look this up online, that came out in Vatican II called Nostra Aetate, which is just Latin for this age, or the current age, our age. And it's a really good statement about what inclusivism is. And so the Catholic Church points out that you can find truth elsewhere, but it's still truth through Jesus Christ would be their affirmation. So that's exclusivism, inclusivism, and then getting to the word pluralism. And I'll add a little caveat here. There are all kinds of lists like this. This is the one I like to use, especially in interfaith work, because it's easy to communicate. But there are other lists like this out there. But then we get to pluralism. And in Alan Race's book, he defined pluralism. And I don't remember specifically which scholars he cited, but the version of pluralism that he put forth would be similar to Houston Smith, whom you mentioned earlier, and another scholar named John Hick. And just what I'm about to say is oversimplifying. And so for all those who practice this kind of pluralism out there, I apologize for oversimplifying, but to communicate quickly, this form of pluralism is the idea that there's one mountain peak and many paths up the mountain. And different religions are different paths up the mountain, but we all get to the same mountain peak. And so that's one view. But what I found a few years ago, let me define, I've started calling that theological pluralism.
It sounds a lot like the elephant, like we're all blind, touching different parts of the elephant. Sure. We're all right, but it's one big elephant and we're experiencing it different. That's religious pluralism.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah.
And so and so I would call that theological pluralism.
Okay.
But I'll introduce civic pluralism, and then I'll explain why the two can be confusing. What I call civic pluralism is pluralism where we work to be good neighbors and work across lines of religious difference to support each other, to cooperate together, to work together for the common good, whatever our religious similarities or differences might be. So with civic pluralism, you could be an exclusivist, you could be an inclusivist, or you could be a theological pluralist and still be a civic pluralist.
Mm.
And so that to me, that's much more inclusive.
Mm.
And I work through my theology all the time. That's one of my favorite. And so I'm still up in the air about theological pluralism. Where do I stand on that?
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of civic pluralism, I know I want to build bridges across lines of religious difference.
Yeah, and it's always so hard because oftentimes when I get into interfaith conversations, it as a progressive Christian, it
Right.
can feel watered down. It can feel
Sure.
like I'm giving up something of my core Christian faith as we're having
Yeah.
these I have to get rid of my belief in Jesus or
Mhm.
something, right?
Yeah.
And I don't want I when I'm in these conversations, I don't want a
Mhm.
Muslim to get rid of their belief in the Quran, right? I
Exactly.
don't I
Mhm.
want to come in genuinely as we are and
Right.
respect one another in this and learn from one another, right? I
Yeah.
mean, I want to learn like why a Muslim finds the Quran. What is it like that's beautiful in this thing? What
Mhm.
is it that's good and true? And
Mhm.
how do we share that with one another? Is that what religious pluralism is getting at, kind of?
Civic, what I'm calling
That's
civic pluralism.
that's civic
The
pluralism.
prob
Okay.
the problem is even in interfaith work with people who know better, they just use the word pluralism
Yeah.
and they don't distinguish between theological or civic pluralism. So I'll tell you two
Yeah.
stories.
Good.
The first one I uh, have, along with others at McMurray University in Little Abilene, Texas. We've worked pretty hard on interfaith things here at McMurray. We don't currently have a lot of Muslim students, but a few years ago, we had a lot of Muslim students who were international students. We had a prayer, we had a prayer room, a designated prayer room for
Mm.
them. We caught a lot of flack for that being in West Texas, not internally. The university was
Yeah.
supportive, but the community, some of them didn't like that.
Yeah.
But that's kind of off track on the story I want to tell. I was conversing with a colleague of mine who is a philosopher in the same department, and he was frustrated with the fact that I was advancing religious pluralism
Mm.
on campus. And I knew him to be an open-minded guy and
Uh-huh.
a deep thinker. He's a philosopher. And we were talking about, and what we realized, he was using pluralism in the way John Hick or Houston Smith would talk about it, what I'm now calling theological pluralism.
Mm.
And I was using the word pluralism, as building bridges, what
Mm.
Diana Eck and Ibu Patel would talk about. And as soon as we realized we were using the word pluralism in two different ways, we were fine.
Mm.
But that rate, I think a lot of people, just like you were explaining a minute ago, I think there are a lot of Christians who are hesitant to get involved in interfaith work because they think they have to give up or water down their faith in
Yeah.
order to do so. And Diana Eck at Harvard, and you can go on her website, pluralism.org. It's just
Mm.
easy to find, pluralism.org, which is a project of Diana Eck and Harvard Divinity School. And she outright says pluralism is not giving up our commitments.
Mm.
Pluralism is engaging with others with our commitments and with their commitments in order to build bridges and build a better world. And
Mm.
so that leads me to the second story I want to tell. There was our interfaith council. We're small, and we've had good times through the years and bad times through the years. Since COVID, we've really been struggling to stay alive for our interfaith council.
Mm.
But we had a group from another city, a much larger city, who has a larger interfaith council, come and talk to us about a year ago. They gave a fantastic presentation. They had good ideas. But then they showed their logo, and their logo was a tree with a bunch of branches. And they said the tree is God and the branches are different
Mm.
religions.
Mhm.
And I'm not criticizing that belief. If someone believes that, that's fine. But I would say that's a particular faith perspective. And so when they said, I thought about the pagan who was seated next to me
Mm.
in that interfaith meeting, who believes in two gods. I thought about the agnostic seated at my
Oh.
table. I thought about a humanist friend of mine who was seated across the room,
Mm.
who is agnostic or atheist. I thought about some Hindus, most Buddhists, and they meant that one tree trunk with many branches. They intended that to be inclusive, but it wasn't. There's a way in which it's not inclusive. And so my argument then is civic pluralism can be inclusive of everybody. I
Mm.
mean, in interfaith work, we include uh, atheists and agnostics too, worldview diversity.
Yeah.
So,
So the reason that the tree with the branches is not inclusive because for some there might be more than one tree, or for some there
right,
might be no tree at all, and we want
right.
to engage with folks who have those different worldviews, right?
That's a good way of putting it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Dina says the golden rule as the base. Yes.
Yes.
Let's do the golden rule. I love it, Dina. That's good. Where
Yeah.
are there?
And interesting that almost every, well, you all, I'm sure, know this, but almost every religion, or at least every large major religion, has some version of the golden rule.
Mhm,
That's
mhm.
everywhere. So
I like that.
that's a good point. Yeah.
Yep. Good stuff, Dina. Thank you for that. Do you find any examples of religious pluralism or civic pluralism in the Bible?
Yeah. You and I were talking earlier about some of the kings
Hmm.
who in the Bible who were outside of the nation of Israel, but were led by God, like Cyrus and Darius. According to the Bible, God used them, especially Cyrus, to bring back the exiles from their time in exile after the Persians defeated the Babylonians. And of course, Cyrus was Zoroastrian.
Mm.
And a fun thing I'll ask my class on world religions, I'll say, what famous rock star was Zoroastrian? Does
Uh-huh.
anybody know? Do you know?
I,
Or does anybody in the comments know? Freddie Mercury.
oh,
Oui.
really?
Freddie Mercury was Zoroastrian. So that's just kind of a fun fact.
That's cool.
But anyway, so that would be an example of how God, according to the Bible, worked through different groups. What wasn't Balaam a different
Oh, I
a
love the story
non-Israelite?
of Balaam.
I
Oh,
cannot remember.
yes. Yes. Yeah. Balaam, as they're going through, Balak is the king and wants
Hmm.
Balaam to curse the Israelites as they're going through. And God
Yeah.
comes to Balaam and says, sorry, you can't do this. I'm on their side. And Balaam goes, sorry, you can't do this. God came to me and said, I'm on their side. So there's
Hmm.
God working through Balaam too. Yeah. A
Yeah.
sorcerer, nonetheless. Uh,
Yeah. Right.
so, yeah. Yeah.
Right.
One of my
And
favorite stories. Yeah, it's so good.
yeah. Yeah. And so one thing that gets kind of confusing, I think, in the Bible when it comes to working with uh, pluralism is first, the Bible doesn't speak with one voice, as
Yeah.
we know. But second, um, in the Hebrew scriptures or Old Testament and in the New Testament, for the most part, or at least at times, we have young communities trying to establish their boundaries. So among the early Hebrews, they were trying to establish their boundaries.
Mm.
And so you can imagine with a people group trying to do that, there's going to be a level of exclusivism. And the same with early Christianity. Uh, and, you know, what I think I would argue, those boundaries have been set now.
Mm.
We don't have to maintain the boundaries in the
Right.
same way. We can still hold our commitments, like you were saying, but we don't have to hold boundaries that exclude other people in the same way that we sometimes find in certain parts of the Bible. But then in the New Testament, I think of Jesus and the Samaritan woman, and I think of Jesus and the Good Samaritan. A lot of people don't know that when Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, everybody today hears that story and we think the Good Samaritan's the good guy.
Uh-huh.
In the first century in Judah or in Galilee, the hearers of that story would have heard Samaritan.
Mm.
That's the bad guy. That's somebody of a different religion. And Jesus uses him as a positive example. And then Paul in Athens talks about the unknown God, trying to make connections. Now, of course, when he does that, he's also at the same time critiquing idolatry. So or what he would have called idolatry. So he
Mm,
wasn't open to all
mm.
religious positions, but he identified this unknown God and said, in him we live and move and have our being. And he was, I would say in that case, there's a little bit of theological pluralism involved there, but I think it would also be an example of civic pluralism. Paul was trying to build a bridge with the people there. And
Because
that was
he's quoting a Greek philosopher,
right.
right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a so whenever people are like talking about scripture, you
Yeah.
got to talk about Greek philosophy too. Stuff that is
Yes.
outside of the Bible that Paul brings into, well, that we now have into scripture. Not that Paul was bringing that into scripture, but it's in our scripture now. So, and it
Right.
comes from outside of Judaism and early Christianity. So,
Mm-hmm.
it's just fascinating stuff. I love it. I'm so glad that Paul did that.
Yes, me too. Yeah.
That's cool. Dina says this is coming out of Texas, y'all. I'm so encouraged and full of hope. Thank you.
You want to hear me say y'all?
Yeah, I do. Yes, I
When I
cannot
travel
do
in
it.
other parts of the country,
Yeah, I'm a Northwesterner, so I can't do
that's
y'all.
right.
So that's funny. So we find theological pluralism in the Bible. What about some aspects of Christian history? Like we tend to think that Christian history, the way that I've been taught by the powers that be in Christianity, is that Christianity has always been this one thing
Mhm.
until progressives Christians came around and ruined all of it.
Right.
Right, but
Right.
that misses like my history of Christianity professors were always like, you cannot talk about early Christianity, you have to talk about early Christianities,
Right.
because
Bart
it's,
Ehrman has a book by that title.
yeah,
Yeah.
because it's always been diverse
Right.
throughout. And so where do you find syncretism is also something that we
Yes.
we think that Christianity has started off as pure, not defiled by things outside of Christianity, whatever that is, but it's
Right.
always kind of uh, brought in other aspects of other cultures within it. Where do we find examples of this?
Okay. I think I'd say a couple of things. First, like you said, the early Christians were very diverse. Most everybody has heard of the Gnostics.
Mhm.
You've probably heard about the Nag Hammadi library and different gospels and so on. There's a web page called earlychristiantexts.com. And I get early Christian texts and early Christian writings mixed up. Those are two different websites.
Ah,
But one of them lists a whole list of all the different scriptures that were floating around from the mid first century all the way up to the mid 300s. And once we got the canon, we had 27 books, but there were dozens, if not hundreds, of books circulating early on. And so that would be an example of pluralism within uh, early Christianity. And then depending on where people were, I think a lot of civic pluralism in history is probably lost to history
mm,
because just average people, say in the time of the early church, there were Jews and Christians, once Christians had their distinct identity from Jews, who were at odds with each other. But I can't help but imagine that there were Jews and Christians who lived next door to each other and went to the market together and babysat each other's
uh,
babies and worked together. And not just within Judaism and Christianity, but I would imagine that happening among different religions in a lot of different parts of the world,
mm.
even when states were at odds with each other over religion. I can imagine there were a lot of average people living out what we would call civic pluralism and in some cases theological pluralism. I'm trying to think of other specific known examples in church history. Uh, we in This actually leads us over into some other religions too
Good.
in history.
Good.
But in medieval Spain, the Muslims became very strong in medieval Spain. But for the most part, they were completely tolerant. Now, there are exceptions, but they were tolerant of the Christians and the Jews who lived there. Again, there were exceptions, but there were societies, in other words, that managed to live together. And then on the neighborhood level, I would think there were probably people who built bridges with each
Mm.
other, whatever their governments were saying. And then some of you have heard of the Jewish philosopher Maimonides. Maimonides built a lot of theological bridges and civic bridges with Islam. And there was a lot of give and take there. And I'm not an expert on Maimonides, but I do know that there was that interaction.
Yeah, I think it was
with
Maimonides and Averroes, the Muslim Averroes, Avicenna,
Mhm.
were good friends, and one of them said that the other was the greatest theologian at the time, or something like that. I think.
I don't
So,
remember. That's
yeah,
a neat quote.
yeah,
Uh-huh.
yeah, yeah. I did a lot of studying of Islam in my for my master's degree, so
Uh-huh.
there
Yeah.
was a lot of like love, and Saint Francis did a lot of
Yes.
bridge building,
Hmm.
bringing presents to the Muslim king, the Muslim
Hmm.
ruler, and they would share presents back and forth and stuff. So yeah, a lot of good history of interfaith friendship there.
Hmm.
Dina says, I don't know where this comes from, but Dina says stuff like Acts 4:12. So I don't have the Bible memorized in my head, unfortunately. So I went and looked up Acts 4:12. Do you?
Oh, yeah. I don't have it memorized either. What does it say?
Right. So
Is it
go ahead.
is it about apoptostasis?
No, Acts
No.
4:12. That would be a great one. We should talk about that too. But
Okay.
Acts 4:12 feels like maybe an exclusive on the surface
Hmm.
of it, exclusivist
Yeah.
view. There is salvation in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given among mortals by which we must be saved. Um,
Right.
so that's referring to the name of Christ, I would imagine.
Yeah.
So, do you, on the spot, any interpretive suggestions for that one?
I again the Bible doesn't speak with one voice,
Yeah,
and I don't. Some people would interpret that very exclusively. I would say that to some degree we all cherry pick. I don't believe there's anybody who does not cherry pick.
perfect.
It's it just happens. Now, if when we do it, we need to do it carefully and try
Right.
to interpret well. But there's no such thing as reading the Bible and not cherry picking. But another passage I would refer to is in Matthew 25,
Mm,
where Jesus says, um, I was hungry and you fed me, thirsty and you gave me drink, sick and you visited me, naked and you clothed me. And they say, when, Lord, did we do these things? So, number one, it wasn't about anything that they believed. And number two, they didn't even realize when they did it. And yet he said, you're going to inherit the kingdom. So that could, one could cite that as an example of inclusivism,
hmm
or one could cite that as an example of pluralism.
hmm
But that's just one take on it.
No, I love it.
And then another thing, Diane Moore at Harvard says religions are internally diverse, which I've already mentioned. And then she says they're historically diverse. They change over time.
Mm,
And in my opinion, some people disagree with me on that, and that's okay. Part of doing this kind of work is people not necessarily agreeing and being okay with that. But in terms of religions changing over time, I think in the world we live in now, there are some things we just have to look at differently
mm,
than some of them did in the world of the Bible.
yes.
Now, if someone is an inerrantist, or that it's either all true or none true, then that doesn't work for them. But I'm okay with the idea of saying, there, I, are exclusive passages in the Bible, and I'm uncomfortable with those. I would interpret more broadly than that.
Yeah, that's good. Dina, it reminds me of a book that I would recommend by Dominic Crossan. It's called God and Empire. So Crossan gets criticized for being an atheist, or I don't know where Crossan is in his whatever he would say, but this is an excellent historical book on exactly these kinds of passages. So he says that there were coins going around that said that had Caesar's image on it, and said there is no other name under heaven that one can be saved than that of Caesar, right? So the early Christians are doing some good political theological digs at the Roman emperor and the Caesars, right?
Yeah,
And
I'm glad you brought that up.
it's much more about what this is saying is salvation for the early Christians in the New Testament is not primarily about where you go after you die. It's about how you live. It's much more, as you've been talking about, the practices and the duties of religion, right? And so it's like, how are we going to live our lives in a way that brings salvation? It's not by living like Caesar. It's by living like Christ. That's where we're going to find salvation. And this is something that anybody can do. Anybody can get salvation in this way, as you excellent reference to Matthew 25. This is something people do, and they don't even realize that they are doing it.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Beautiful stuff. I love it.
Right. I might mention a few things, if you want, about pluralism in more recent history in the United States.
Yes.
Okay. Some of you will be familiar with the Immigration Act of 1965, and then it was amended in 1990. And so starting in 1965, the US had a lot more immigrants than in the past, and many of them were other religions. And so this brought about a lot of religious diversity, which started stirring the pot. Do they get rejected? Do they get accepted? And right after World War II, in the context of Soviet communism, there was a big push on, if you're American, you're Christian, and that being Christian Americans is the way we oppose atheistic communism.
Yes.
And that was just kind of in the water from World War II up until the mid 60s. And it's still kind of in the water now to some degree. But with the Immigration Act of 1965, the US started getting a lot more religiously diverse. And remember what I said about diversity, it can be good or it can be bad. And it's been both. But on the good side, people have, and in our case, Christians, because many of us were already here, have tried to engage across lines. And there have been other people who have welcomed that. And that's one reason that Diana X started the Pluralism Project, just looking at the widespread diversity, and then how do we engage that diversity in a way that's constructive and in a way that builds a better society.
I love it. And Ibu Patel has been doing a lot of work on this too. When I lived in Chicago for 9 years or so, and he had a project throughout the country where he would, I forget what it was called, but he would invite college students to get together who were from diverse religions and have them work on a project that they can do together, and have that be the primary focus. And you would say, out of that, like where they have this mission that they're doing together, they might have conversations about their religion, but the primary focus is about getting this service project done. Right.
That's where Ibu started. And we had the fortune of having him speak here a few years ago, which was really neat. He's a great guy. But you're exactly right. That's how he started. It was Interfaith Youth Corps back then, and they've now rebranded as Interfaith America. And so they have the same services they did previously, but they've expanded into racial justice and diversity and a lot of different things, trying to build bridges. But yeah, he started that way. We have sent students to training in Chicago, and I've gone to training in Chicago. So a lot of what I know about interfaith work comes from the work of Interfaith America and Ibu Patel. And sometimes people think teaching world religions is the same as interfaith work.
Hmm.
I could teach world religions all day long and know about different religions and still not have the skills to do interfaith work.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the things that Interfaith America does is to train people to be interfaith leaders. How do you build bridges in your community?
Hmm.
And so we have a group on campus, another one of our groups that declined during COVID. We're continuing to try to rebuild, but it's called Better Together, which is an interfaith student group,
Beautiful.
which is based on the principles of Interfaith America. And they have a great the resources on their website you cannot imagine.
Hmm.
They've got courses that are free, all kinds of stuff for people to look at on their website. And another thing to be aware of when you look at their website, and I've mentioned this to you before, they use the word pluralism all alone. And so people could misinterpret that word pluralism.
Yeah.
But they use it to mean what I'm calling civic pluralism, reaching out and building relationships. And especially the way they define it, just like you started out a minute ago, is working together for the common good. And you don't have to be able to teach world religions to work on a service project with someone else from another religion. And you get to know them there. And that's civic pluralism.
I need to ask for some advice on a
Okay.
personal level. So
Sure.
this isn't personal, but I have noticed that it is very easy for me to work with other people who are of a similar liberal progressive mindset on
Right.
doing civic pluralism.
Mhm.
But it's much harder to work with people of a let's just say different mindset that's not
Right.
liberal and progressive. Oftentimes on my social media, somebody will have a back and forth with me trying to argue, and I will get to the point where I'm like, hey, why don't we work together to do a fundraiser for a children's hospital in your area? And they will say, sorry, can't do it, can't be unequally yoked, which is as you know, is a reference to a letter in the New Testament where it says you shouldn't marry somebody of a different religion or something like that, right? So how have you had any strategies or success, or do you know of any strategies and success to interfaith conversations with people of a similar theological bent can be easier than people even intra or within the same religion of liberal and conservative can be much, much more challenging. I've noticed. Do you have any strategies of bridging that divide?
That's hard. And our interfaith council here in Abilene, our board met last night, and we're trying to figure that out. We don't know yet. Abilene is very conservative, as you would guess, being in West Texas. And those of us who aren't Christian nationalists and those of us who aren't inclined as fundamentalists, a lot of us have kind of found each other. So I have a sense of community here. But there are those who don't want us, and that's hard. I can't remember if I've mentioned this in this conversation yet or not. I did. We formed a Muslim prayer room here on campus, and we got a lot of criticism from the community, and it even got into the Drudge Report nationwide. Wow. It was people attacking us, and we call them our students, and these are students who happen to be Muslim. The people criticizing us were calling them terrorists, and they're not. Yeah. The story behind starting the prayer room, there were some students who were praying in their apartment because if they're devout, they pray 5 times a day. They were praying in their apartment. Their next door neighbor called the FBI on them, and which was just embarrassing to them and devastating. And we thought, we've got to give them a safe place on campus to have prayer. And fortunately, our president, Dr. Sandra Harper, is very open on this kind of thing and extremely supportive. And she was willing to take the heat. We took some heat from donors, and she was willing to take the heat, and others of us did as well. And on a, kind of a funny comment that she made once, she said, I wish my biggest problem as president of the university was finding a place for students to pray. So,
wow.
So anyway, back to the issue. It's hard to connect in that way. Ebu has there. I cannot remember the man's name. There's an evangelical pastor in the Metroplex, the Dallas-Fort Worth area, that Ebu has connected with. And I think he's pretty much an exclusivist, but he's full steam behind civic pluralism, wanting to welcome the neighbor. He says Christianity is about being hospitable. Christianity is about welcoming the neighbor. And so we're going to do that. And so there are those out there who do that. We're having difficulty finding them in Abilene right now.
Yeah.
Ebu has a saying that I think is helpful on a rational level. It doesn't necessarily make a difference on the ground yet. But Ebu says, I will work with anyone. And he says, remember, diversity isn't just the diversity you like.
Yes, that's good.
And he said, I'll work with anyone short of buying a brownie at the KKK bake sale. So
Luke earlier said diversity is good until you have Nazis coming to your
that's right.
to your neighborhood, right? And we've got that up here in the Northwest, and it's unfortunately not isolated to any one place in the U.S. anymore. So,
and I'm sure we could have a whole other conversation about problems with diversity and some of the issues it's causing. So I would agree that diversity can be used in a horrible way. But part of what I feel I'm supposed to be doing and working with others, it's not just me. There are a lot of good people around who are working on this. But part of what I'm supposed to be doing is working with diversity in a way that's good instead of a way that's bad.
I love it. I love it. Raylene says being raised in a faith tradition that says our way is the only way, and gifting self by walking away from the separatism that never felt God-led sure brought a sense of well-being and much more precious growth to Raylene. That reminds me, we just recently had in the lectionary where Jesus sends the disciples out into towns, and the disciples are like, well, what do we do if they don't accept us? Do we, fire and brimstone on them? Like stories of the past. And Jesus says, nope, just shake the dust off your feet and move on. Right. So sometimes it comes down to that. So
that's right. Yeah.
Let's see. Dina gives us a hell yes. So nicely done, Mark. You got the hell yes from Dina.
What the hell yes. We say that in Texas too.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. That's good. Well, Mark, anything else that you wanted to say in the show before we end up?
Well, I realized earlier I didn't get to the end of the question. It was my fault because I rambled too long. The question about why religion is problematic with colonialism.
Yes, I wrote that down. I wrote that down as something to ask you. Yeah, please.
Okay. As I've already said, there are a lot of countries that don't have a word for religion, or a lot of languages. And for a lot of people, what we would call their religion is just what they do. They don't think I have a religion. They think this is my life. And I'll use India as an example, but this is true in a lot of other places as well. Hinduism has 6 different philosophical systems, including one that's atheistic. And so talk about internally diverse with Hinduism, plus and so I would call Hinduism a family of religions. But Westerners, and the Persians were first to do this. The word Hinduism comes from Sindhu, which is the name of a river, and it got westernized into Hindu. But at first, the word Hindu just identified the location where they were by the Sindhu River. And then people came in, and particularly colonialists came in and identified this whole group of diverse people with they mostly depended on the Vedas, so they did have the Vedas in common, but this very diverse group of people, and called them all Hindus.
Mm.
And then they went on from there and decided what they were calling Hindus is what they were going to call a religion.
Mm.
And that's happened in a lot of parts of the world. So we can identify what we would call religion. Some people say that religion is just a scholar's word, and it's broader than that. But early on, anthropologists from England who never traveled, who lived in England, talked about different religions in other parts of the world based on the hearsay they had gotten back. And so religion came a tag for some of these different cultural elements. And I think it's fine that we call it religion now, as long as we're in agreement with what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. But there are a lot of people who don't think of themselves, who we would call religious, and they don't think of themselves as religious. Shinto and Buddhism in Japan, probably. And there are enough Westerners there where they might think about religion now. And there have been times when Shintos and Buddhists were in conflict in Japan. That was because of state Shinto. It was more of a political thing. But, one priest will do their wedding and another will do their funeral. And they don't think about, we're in different religions.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Good stuff. Well, if people do you have any books that you have written or that you would recommend if people want to dive deeper into this topic?
I have some articles, not books. I have an article that is coming out in August. It's in an encyclopedia, and I can send you the words about that. It basically, it's, of all things, a guy in the business school got me to write this article.
Oh, wow.
It's, of all things, an encyclopedia on entrepreneurship, but they have a section on social entrepreneurship. And Eboo Patel is a social entrepreneur. So I kind of tell Eboo's story in that article. And then the article I sent you is one that'll come out in the Interfaith Observer pretty soon, talking about pluralism. And I have a couple of others in there. And obviously there are tons of good books and I've got a few other articles, but I've not written a book. But there are tons of good books that people can read. Go on Amazon and enter Eboo Patel's name.
Yeah.
And you'll find a lot of good books. Go on Amazon to get kind of another angle on what I've been talking about. Enter Paul Knitter's name, Knitter.
Okay.
And he's a Catholic theologian. He was a young man during Vatican II and was there to kind of translate Latin. And he's now grown up into a theologian. I think he taught at Union Seminary for a while. But he wrote a book called Without the Buddha, I Could Not Be a Christian.
Oh, wow.
And so that's very interesting. And so Paul Knitter, let me think, Diana Eck, ECK, Raimundo Panikkar, Panikkar. He's deceased now, but he wrote like 40 or 50 books. And so you can just kind of trudge through those on the internet and decide which one that you'd like to read. There is an Indian theologian that I apologize, I'm going to butcher his first name, but I think it's Kalarakal. Well, the name, if you'll click on my link, unpacking pluralism, that's embedded in that article I sent you, you'll get him.
Okay.
But I can describe his thinking, which is interesting.
Okay.
He talks about what he calls inclusive pluralism, which is different than inclusivism or pluralism that we've talked about. Although it would fit with civic pluralism, I think, and to some degree with theological pluralism. He wants to find, he's Christian, and he wants to find what's beautiful in other religions and figure out how he can apply that as a committed Christian.
Yes.
And so that's what he would call inclusive pluralism.
Beautiful. I love that. I love it.
Good stuff. Aleal, I believe is his last name.
Okay. Okay. Good stuff. Good stuff. Well, Mark, thank you so much for being here and for
it's been a delight. I've enjoyed it.
Love it. Love it. And thank you, everybody, for being here and for watching. You can keep up with One Question with Pastor Adam here on Facebook and on YouTube, also wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you listen to a place where you can rate and review and leave a comment, that would be awesome. And the best way you can help the show is by telling somebody about it. So if you enjoyed this show, tell a friend, tell a family member, go check it out. And once again, thank you, Mark, for being here.
Of course, and I want to thank those who listened in, and their comments were great. Their
Awesome.
questions were great.
Always
Yeah.
good. Always good stuff. So,
Mhm.
all right, friends, we will do this again next Thursday at 11 o'clock Pacific here on the Pastor Adam Facebook page and the Clackamas United Church of Christ Facebook page. Until next week, friends, God be with you.
Thank you all very much.